once upon a time, perhaps long ago in your lineage, but somewhere in your lineage, you also came from people that had to have a connection to the land. And there was some sort of force of, whether it's race or class, some sort of upper people broke that relationship in order to use your land and use your labor. It's kind of the unveiling of the story that has existed since this settler state has existed, of there's a small amount of people that are benefiting the most from extracted land and labor.
What caused climate change? When you ask yourself that question, you might think of an answer like burning fossil fuels or greenhouse gas emissions. But even though we've known for decades that emissions contribute to climate change, we've continued to emit more each year. So what's the reason behind this? Answering that question requires us to examine ourselves, the systems we inhabit, and our relationship with nature. Today, we have the honor of hearing an Indigenous perspective on how we arrived here and what we could do differently.
Welcome to the Pulse of Change podcast, where we explore the connection between climate change and health by sharing stories about taking action. I'm Lana Voracek.
And I am David Acuna.
Danhunzu Hadi Janelle Lapointe Statni Stellat'en First Good day, hello. My name's Janelle Lapointe. I'm from Stellat'en First Nation, which is located in the northern interior of British Columbia. I'm Caribou Clan, but I've been living and working on the beautiful unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people since 2018.
Janelle Lapointe is the co-lead of public engagement and mobilization at the David Suzuki Foundation, a climate justice organizer and a climate panelist on CBC. In the first part of this episode, Janelle shares her story with us, including the moment that changed her path, leading her away from traditional career plans towards a responsibility to protect her land and her people. Next, we'll interview her about her work as a climate and Indigenous rights organizer and her perspectives on the root causes of the climate and affordability crisis. Finally, we'll hear what she's learned along the way, how she stays resilient, and how we can support climate justice ourselves. Before we dive any deeper into the episode, we want to remind you that Canada is a colonial state.
Indigenous people are the only people that have lived sustainably on these lands, and they did so for millennia through their relationship and knowledge of the land. And the whole kind of birth of the Canadian state was because of the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, in which the Canadian state claimed that there was nothing here and it was therefore theirs to take.
Colonialism is when a country uses force to take control over a territory's people, resources, culture, and government. Colonialism is part of Canada's history, but also its present, because the systems that were created to control Indigenous peoples are still in place, including the Indian Act. The need to shift away from these systems has been recognized by the Government of Canada and the British Columbia Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. As interviewers, we acknowledge that we're settlers in the capitalist and colonialist state of Canada. Now, with this important context in mind, let's get back to the episode.
I spent my first 18 years in this small community and really couldn't wait to leave it. But I was really surprised at how homesick I was. And then all of a sudden grief-stricken by just how big the systemic problems were and how it was so easy for me to draw connections back to my home and back to my lived experience.
Janelle is proud and grateful to have grown up on her matrilineal homelands.
Stella is the name of the village on unceded Dakaf territory. It's a really small rural community. There's about 200 members of the nation that live on reserve. I grew up just really with a lot of curiosity and freedom to get to run around. I always say that being a middle child is kind of crucial to my climate organizing because my mom was super busy with a young baby and also a bit of a bratty teenager. And that left me often sent outside to entertain myself.
Through the many hours she spent playing outside, she developed a strong appreciation for the beauty of her land and an awareness of how quickly it was changing.
My community, like many Indigenous rural communities, are kind of like a microcosm of the impacts of capitalism and colonialism. So on one hand, we have the natural beauty, so much fresh water, really pristine forests and wildlife. But also there's a highway forced through the territory. There's sea and railroad forced through the territory. And pretty much all of the economic development in the region is from different boom and bust resource extraction industries. And I noticed how quickly the forest changed. It's very evident the impacts of an unsustainable forestry practice in my territory. You'll notice the monocrops and the massive cut blocks pretty much immediately.
But even before that, she noticed the impacts on a local species that she had come to greatly appreciate.
I always say that, a lot of people refer to environmentalists as tree huggers, but I was a fish hugger first. I loved growing up on the Stella River, which is right where my grandmother was born, and hanging out with the salmon, getting to fish and eat right from the river from my stream until I was about 10 years old or so, when the salmon stocks began drastically collapsing so much that our family had to travel to other watersheds in order to get salmon. That was only noticeable because of what I was seeing with my eyes, but from actually the food I consume and the connection to a traditional food source and livelihood.
In spite of her close connection with the land, Janelle dreamed of leaving her community behind once she grew up.
I knew that there was so much more out there, and I really thought that I was going to live this awesome city girl life. I was the first generation in my family to be going to university. I was the first in my family to not attend residential schools or day school. So I was really kind of experiencing life in a really different new way. All the guidance I had was really from external mainstream society, which of course tells you to grow up, get an education, girl boss your way through it and make a lot of money. And so that's what I was aspiring to do.
But early on in her first year of university, she started feeling homesick. Things just didn't feel how she thought they would. And at first, she wasn't sure why.
I started making connections at university and really gaining more learning and understanding and really getting the language to describe the picture I was trying to paint of my homelands. I, of course, wasn't used to using words like capitalism or colonialism to describe the root causes of the immediate experience that I was having. So coming to that learning and understanding, I was all of a sudden grief-stricken by just how big the systemic problems were and how it was so easy for me to draw connections back to my home and back to my lived experience. And so I kept going through my studies, wasn't quite sure of what a different life would look like until I was about in third year of university, when I had this kind of turning point experience where I was, again, really missing home and was at awards gala for my student union and for the university. And there was an elder doing a land acknowledgement that was so reminiscent of my grandmother, like same stature, was speaking in the same cadence. And then I found out that she's actually from a nation near mine. So that was certainly not helping the homesickness, but I was really, really paying attention to this elder. And she really took her time with the land acknowledgement and was very eloquently describing a relationship to the land and the responsibilities that we have as guests in the university. And that was starting to trigger like, oh, this was a relationship I used to have on my homelands. And now I'm being invited to form a new relationship as a guest on these nations' territory. And it was really provoking a lot of emotions, and I was really closing my eyes and in it with her, listening to her words. And when I opened my eyes, she was quickly being helped off stage. And this massive, literally, it was like cartoonish, so this massive check from the Kinder Morgan pipeline was being presented right behind her with a $500,000 donation to the university. And people were standing up and cheering, and I was stunned by the disconnect. And that for me was a very poignant reflection of removing Indigenous people to make way for this money, and then also the tokenization of hearing nice words from the elder, but actually not taking it seriously. After that experience is when I really tried to listen to those words and started getting involved with some of the grassroots organizing that was happening against Trans Mountain. And that taught me so much and completely reorientated my path in the world to being really connected to community and to organizing.
As she went on to graduate university and work in event planning, Janelle continued to participate in community organizing until one day she had an opportunity to bridge her two worlds.
I came across a job posting for the David Suzuki Foundation, and it was an entry-level coordinator position. I kind of thought I could stretch some of my skills because event planning requires you to wear a lot of hats and to be really flexible and adaptable. So I was like, I can maybe make myself look good to this position. And I actually had that one job interview and like 7 others that were for new event contracts. And I had done so much interviewing. I was getting callbacks for new event jobs. Hadn't heard back from the foundation yet. And I was trying to buy time. A couple offers had to say, no, sorry, we can't give you any more time. And so I had to decline and honestly gamble that hopefully this would work out, because I was quickly burnt out by trying to climb the corporate ladder. I was just very relieved at the opportunity to be connected to like-minded people in the workplace. And thankfully I got the call back and was able to join the organization where I've been for the past 5 years.
Coming up next, we'll interview Janelle about her work as a climate organizer and the importance of Indigenous wisdom in fighting the climate crisis.
Indigenous people are the only people that have survived sustainably on these lands and don't just have a culture that's about land connection. They actually have governance structures and laws that they use to survive on those lands, and therefore they have a lot to teach us if we're going into a new transformation of society where we can live more closely into that land.
First of all, can you briefly describe your work as a climate organizer?
My day job is at the David Suzuki Foundation, currently working public engagement and mobilization, but I wear a lot of hats in the environmental ecosystem. So I'm a part of a few different organizations, Common Horizon, which is a grassroots organizing group, 7Gen Energy, which is an Indigenous clean energy organization. And I love to do a lot of speaking and advocacy. So I'm a part of the climate panel that's on CBC. I really see my role, no matter what hat I'm wearing, is to really forefront intersectionality and make sure that there is a strong Indigenous voice in environmental and climate work. And then I also see a role in storytelling and naming the enemy of the climate crisis, which I believe to be the corporate elite, the capitalist class, the billionaires, the 1%, whatever words you want to call it. And I really use my advocacy to help name that villain and for people to feel their anger and their grief really directed towards the people that are perpetuating the climate crisis.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because there's a lot of anger being directed at many different sources right now in relation to climate change. Some people are angry at corporations, some people are angry at environmentalists, some people are angry at each other. And my personal instinct is to shy away from feeling anger. So I find it really refreshing to hear how you are trying to harness anger in a constructive way. And just to dig a little deeper into this concept of intersectionality that you mentioned, just briefly explain it for everybody listening. So intersectionality is the way that different parts of a person's identity, like for example, their race, their gender, their class, these different parts of their identity can combine, and that can change how they experience society. So for example, someone who is a woman of color might be affected by these different identities of gender and also ethnicity. compared to somebody who is a white woman, she might have a very different experience in the workplace, and a white male might have a different experience than both of them. So having explained that, you mentioned that you are trying to make sure that intersectionality is at the forefront of climate action. So how can you do that? How can we do that?
I think this need to be intersectional has been driven by a lot of factors, but one in recent memory is the movement for Black Lives that was born out of the United States. And I think quickly everybody who is in the progressive space really tried to adopt these commitments and adopt this language of intersectionality. But I worry that people haven't really fleshed out what that means or looks like. And more importantly, why do we do intersectionality? And if you ask people that, you're going to get a variety of answers. And a lot of people are just a little surface level about it. It's like, why do we do it? It's because it's the right thing to do. You know, inclusive spaces make us feel good. It earns those brownie points with our community. But my whole kind of approach to intersectionality is, what is the strategic reason we do it? Why is having Indigenous voices at the forefront not just the right thing to do, but why is it the crux of how we will win in this movement? And I can think of a lot of reasons that I hold really close to my heart in this work. One is that Indigenous people are the only people that have survived sustainably on these lands and don't just have a culture that's about land connection. They actually have governance structures and laws that they use to survive on those lands. And therefore, they have a lot to teach us if we're going into a new transformation of society where we can live more closely into that land. And so right now, I'm really keen on helping people come up with their own strategic whys and to really see their stake in intersectionality beyond just it's the right good thing to do, and to really feel ownership of, I'm doing this because it's the crux of how we'll win. And I think everyone in the climate movement is desperate for a win right now after, not feeling it for several, a generation.
Absolutely. And I think helping people develop their own strategic whys is such a powerful step in transformation, because intrinsic motivation that comes from within us will take us so much farther than the surface level reasons that you mentioned, like people thinking that they are only doing it to do the right thing. And in a bio of yours that we read, it said that you have been front-loading a movement to demand a Green New Deal. Can you talk about that?
I was invited to be a part of a group of organizers from across the entire country, from a bunch of different contexts, to go through this front-loading process, which is really just like an in-depth strategic planning process. It's the same process that movements like If Not Now or Sunrise in the United States went through. And we were trying to figure out what was next for the climate movement after the rise and the die down of the youth climate movement that was put forward by Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, and of course had come to a bit of a halt just because of the pandemic. So I got to be a part of that process for several years. And what was born out of it is a multinational movement called Common Horizon, who really aims towards winnable solutions that actually improve the lives of everyday people, and to really make the connection to the moment we're in, which is one of extreme inequity, especially when it comes to the affordability crisis and the economic crisis. And I think people across the entire country are really feeling like that and don't necessarily know how that relates to other issues that they are also really worried about, like the climate crisis. We've kind of moved away from the Green New Deal framing in order to come up with a new vision for Common Horizon, but same kind of goal of winnable solutions that are not just about lowering emissions or addressing the climate crisis.
And you've mentioned affordability. Can you clearly lay out for everyone listening the relationship between climate change and affordability?
I think this became very clear in the pandemic when we were experiencing this global health crisis of COVID-19. So many corporations had their best profit years ever during the time when all of us were mass struggling with layoffs and with loneliness and isolation. And coming out on the other side of that, we have continued to see the rise of everyday things that we need, including groceries, while, again, those same corporations continue to break their profits year after year after year and have made their wealth from the exploitation of land and resources and also of labor of everyday people. And it's that same extractive mentality that is perpetuating the climate crisis. And some of those corporations and the executives at those corporations are actually directly tied in with the capital E extraction of like mining, oil, gas, forestry. And that is absolutely, the people to blame for the many converging crises we're experiencing. All this time, life hasn't gotten any more affordable. And on top of that, we are dealing with extreme climate events. And on top of that, most of us are letting our dreams die of owning homes or even starting families, which is what has been the capitalist dream for the generations that came before us. And there's also the constant question and rebuttal of, okay, like you want climate solutions. Well, that's going to be too expensive. And how can that be true when there is immense wealth at the top of our society? And what would it look like if we tax them appropriately in order to pay for solutions that can make our lives better and healthier? It's not a new challenge. It's kind of the unveiling of this story that has existed since this settler state has existed, of there's a small amount of people that are benefiting the most from extracted land and labor. That veil is becoming thin, and now we have the opportunity to make them pay their fair share in order to get us out of the climate crisis and to stop price gouging us at the grocery store.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that connection. And you've hinted at policy level solution we can take, like changing tax structures and maybe regulations. What's an example of some of the everyday win solutions at the community level that Common Horizons is pushing for?
We definitely want what the solutions look like to be really grounded in what community needs. So as the movement grows, we're doing lots of community building relationships with people in their workplaces, in their schools, in their neighborhoods. What would climate solutions look like for the public education sector, for example? Like, can we win solutions that are retrofitting schools so that students aren't sitting in sweaty classrooms trying to learn? Let's get heat pumps for cooling and energy. If we have a school in every neighborhood, why can't they have a solar panel on the roof that's powering the rest of the community around them? Those are just some examples, but I think it would really have to be led by teachers and our people that are a part of that sector. And that's the work that the movement hopes to do, is to connect with working people and not just kind of top down impose solutions, but say what would actually make your working life better. Situations like that, I think, can really transform neighborhoods and workplaces, which I think people care about because we are a part of those networks every single day.
Do you have examples of what you mentioned of Indigenous systems of governance and maybe how we can apply them to our current political landscape?
We have a whole new generation that are really disillusioned with voting and wanting to support governments, because on one hand, we have right-wing governments that in some cases are outright saying climate change is not real, and in other ways they're promising to go all in on the industry that are perpetuating the climate crisis. And then we have, on the other hand, what is supposed to be a more progressive government that is telling us, yes, we believe in the climate crisis, but we're also going to buy a pipeline. Yes, we believe in the crisis, but we're going to say the nice words and not actually implement the solutions at scale that we need. Instead of that being a threat that's making us withdraw from these institutions and not engage, I really wanted to challenge people to engage with Indigenous nations as nations. So what would it look like to lend some of our resources that we use to convince the government to change, and instead to work with Indigenous nations who have these worldviews and these opportunities to live in the way that we're trying to fight for. For concrete examples, I'm about to head to Prince Rupert to participate in the Peace and Unity Summit, which was previously hosted for the past 2 years by the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and are now going to be hosted by the 9 allied nations. And those are people who are still living these laws in action. And if you go to their territory, it's really clear because they're one of the few places in Canada where you can drink right from the stream. And they have the pristine nature that we're rapidly losing. And, I think all Canadians actually choose to live here because of the pristine nature. Following that kind of leadership and ways that they're protecting their land can teach us so much.
And how can people who were raised with this Western perspective in which capitalism is so normalized, how can we learn and engage with Indigenous values and Indigenous perspectives when we are embedded in a colonial context like the country of Canada or the city of Vancouver?
I'm constantly telling people, engage with Indigenous people, follow Indigenous leadership, and people are so daunted by that task. But the way I've been explaining it recently is hopefully all of us know what it's like to build a friendship and what it's like to be a good friend. And I think that's the kind of spirit that I invite people into connecting with their Indigenous nation. I think the first one is learn whose territory you're on. There's lots of resources like native-land.ca that you can learn about the place names and territories. You can then follow those nations and see what kind of community events they're throwing and places where they're inviting settlers to participate, which there are many of. And then, also the calls to action to stand with them when it comes to fighting some of these major resource projects. And I think just taking up those simple invitations and just showing face and getting to speak to people in the community with no expectation is a good starting point. And I think the key is just to really think about what reciprocity means. So you're not going there just to extract knowledge and information. You're there to listen, and you might get lucky and hear a really valuable story in the process. And you also might have a lot of skills and insights that you can lend back to them. So yeah, I really just invite people to think about the spirit of relationship building, the spirit of reciprocity, and then also what it would mean to be a good friend. And a lot of people are afraid of doing that because they're afraid they don't have the right level of knowledge, or they may say or do the wrong thing or offend an Indigenous person. And part of being a friend is that sometimes we do say or do the wrong thing and we mess up. And then there'll be a learning opportunity to learn about how to reparate that in a good way. And so I would just invite people to not let fear or ego get in the way of making the first step, which could be as simple as showing up to a community event.
Thank you so much. That's such a powerful answer. And I think it's a great and approachable call to action for people who might be looking for a starting point. And you mentioned how Indigenous peoples are able to relate to the land in a way that helps preserve its pristine nature, and how the rest of Canada is missing that. I guess for me personally, I was privileged to take a course about Indigenous health. And after learning a little bit more about how Indigenous peoples relate to the land, it just seemed very clear to me that colonialism has caused climate change by disrupting those ways of relating to the land. Can you share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental truth that I think everyone that's concerned about the climate really needs to grapple with and understand. Indigenous people are the only people that have lived sustainably on these lands, and they did so for millennia through their relationship and knowledge of the land. When I think about where I come from in my community, I don't know if folks have been to northern BC, but it's a place that experiences all four seasons, hot summers sometimes and really long, hard winters, and then the shoulder seasons that have opportunities to harvest and to get ready for winter. And so in order to survive that and to be able to move around nomadically, of course, you had to have a strong relationship with the land. On the other hand, settler colonialism in Canada and the whole kind of birth of the Canadian state was because of the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, in which the Canadian state claimed that there was nothing here and it was therefore theirs to take. And all of the terrible things that have been done and perpetuated to Indigenous people has been all about breaking that relationship to the land in order to get access to the resources, in order to make a profit. And that was not the first country to do that. The whole global history has a strong story of imperialism and displaced people, including European settlers. Once upon a time, perhaps long ago in your lineage, but somewhere in your lineage, you also came from people that had to have a connection to the land. And there was some sort of force of, whether it's race or class, some sort of upper people broke that relationship in order to use your land and use your labor. And I think learning that helps us connect to the global context. And although it sometimes feels daunting to be like, oh no, I have to like learn about colonialism, imperialism, and all these different places in the world, to me, that's been so cathartic to know that my struggles are connected to so many other people's alive and also past. I really feel connected to this whole movement lineage of people that have fought progressive movements and also people that have resisted in order to protect their land. And what a beautiful thing that we could all be a part of if people really take up that call to learn about imperialism and colonialism and in order to connect the dots on how that is the root cause of the climate crisis.
Thank you for that. And I'm wondering if you have an everyday example of how you relate to the land in a way that is different from the Western paradigm.
I really, really see my relationship to the land as like my relationship to family, to relatives. And because I have that, and because I love and care for all of my family and relatives, I really take the harm that's being done to the land really personally, because I know that violence against the land is violence against myself and violence against all Indigenous peoples. And so it really keeps me grounded in just like that struggle and that orientation of feeling interconnected to people and to non-human kin. And, you know, a lot of Indigenous people say that. And I think people are like, oh, that's like a nice sentiment. But it's also like biologically very, very, very true. It's like we are mostly water and depend on the health of our waterways. We cannot last very long without air, and therefore we all need clean air. You know, Western science is catching up to the sentiment that Indigenous people have had a long time, but we're constantly being pulled into the like, be productive, work hard, make money mentality that is constantly trying to drag us away from that, which is why I think it's really important to be intentional about that relationship all the time. And like I said, about how we act with Indigenous people, we all know how to be in relation and we're all learning to be in relation. I think you can take that same spirit of relationship building and reciprocity to the tree in your backyard or the stream in your neighborhood and learn a lot from it.
Thank you so much. And you kind of hit on another question that I wanted to ask, because this podcast is about health and climate change. And on a very high level, we've talked about colonialism and equity, which are important determinants of health. But now also you've highlighted the fact that connection to the land is part of our health biologically as well as holistically. And in your time of doing this work of mobilizing climate action, what progress have you seen and where do you hope that things will go?
There's certainly been progress on awareness of climate for the very real and terrifying reason of pretty much all of us have experienced climate impacts. That was something that I experienced very young. I live in a region that's been experiencing severe wildfires before it became the summer norm that we're all kind of living. We experience, of course, extreme heat. We're in the middle of a heat wave right now, and that kind of dangerously cyclical nature of going from drought to fire to flood every year is the norm. And so we're at a point where climate change is undeniable, but we've also, in that time of progressing to this place, have seen massive moments of people coming together to fight that. We had so many people in the streets in 2019 to raise awareness on climate change. We've also had major Indigenous-led movements and so many demonstrations for climate, but also, I think, intersectioning issues like peace or work on the affordability crisis that are starting to, I think, really highlight not only our need for climate action, but our need for each other. And so I hope that continues and that we continue to build community and just connection around core issues, whether that's in the streets or whether it's in our workplace or whether it's just in our family homes for right now. But I think when I was young, I definitely was a part of the individual action sustainability camp. And I think people are now realizing that's good and important, but we actually need organizing and we need people and we need to talk to our friends and family about the things that are very real and scary for us and figure out collective action that we can take together.
Stay tuned for the last part of our episode, where Janelle shares what she's learned along the way, how she stays resilient, and how we can all join her in taking action.
We don't think about that enough in our day-to-day. It's really incredible that we biologically survived. And then on top of that, we come from a legacy of movements and brilliant thinkers and writers that have left us so much knowledge to learn from.
Just thinking back on your 5+ years journey of climate organizing, what key lessons have you learned?
I always say my climate journey officially started 5 years ago, but I actually think it started when I was 3 or 4 years old and started noticing the forests and streams around me and really kind of growing into this place of responsibility as a Dakat woman to protect the places and the people I love. I think I very briefly touched on my many different orientations to that work, from individual action to the absolute power of collective action. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is just learning like how powerful I am, but also how powerful we are. And that has been the catalyst to so many different learnings and takeaways, is just learning the power of mass movement. And, you know, when the climate movement is able to scale and to be that powerful force that I dream of, we will do so knowing we rest on the shoulder of so many other movements that have fought and won before us. And so I'm really grateful that I've learned about that legacy I come from, and just learned that power is stifled by capitalism. They don't want us to know that we are all interconnected and that we're so powerful together. And I think just that understanding has been so revolutionary to me.
Thank you. Do you have examples of some of these movements that you envision the climate movement becoming, that it can stand on the shoulders of?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples. My family is Black from the United States and benefited from the amazing, incredible bravery and organizing of the civil rights movement. I use the civil rights example because it's personal to me and my lineage, but there's so many movements in Canada that were never taught about and actually reveal the power, including the feminist labor movement that won us some of the amazing worker wins that we get to enjoy, including getting breaks. Also, so many Indigenous-led movements, like we had the moment for Idle No More, where we had hundreds and thousands of Indigenous people and allies out in the streets in order to raise awareness on Indigenous issues. And that's huge to know how much that has shifted the dial.
What makes you feel resilient in spite of the challenges that we're facing?
I think learning about legacy, not only from my biological legacy, which is already amazing to know that we are here because we come from people who've survived against all odds. We don't think about that enough in our day-to-day. It's really incredible that we biologically survived. And then on top of that, we come from a legacy of movements and brilliant thinkers and writers that have left us so much knowledge to learn from. And in the future, we will also have future ancestors that will benefit from our movements and our survival. And so that connection to legacy makes me feel really teeny tiny small in a way that I think is really beautiful, that allows me to be like, yes, it's a gift that I'm here and I'm going to take up the responsibility to give in with me, but also I'm going to do my best. I'm going to win some and I'm going to lose a lot. And that will leave the next generation better off because I tried. And yeah, we don't have to solve everything. I think if we really put our mind, our money, and our resources towards addressing the climate crisis, the world will look a lot better, but there will always be inequities we need to solve, and some of it will be left up to the future generation. And it just gives me hope that I get to be a part of it.
Do you have a call to action for people who are either experiencing climate injustice or who want to be allies for those who are?
I would say you have everything you need and you just don't know it yet. And you have immense power within yourself and also in your connections. And so I always urge people to join a local organizing group or a movement for change near you. But if that's not available for you or you don't know what that is, we also have networks in our neighborhood and networks in our workplaces and networks in our family. And that could be a good starting point for you too. It's just to have a conversation about climate with your local networks. And I think you can start building institutional power just via the beautiful web that's already around you.
Thank you so much for coming on with us today. It's been so amazing to learn from you. And just one final question. Are there any specific things that are currently happening that you would like to direct people to in terms of actions they can take or initiatives that are going on?
I would direct people to Common Horizon. It's Common Horizon Commune on Instagram. They're starting to build out local chapters and may already exist in a city near you. And we're going to have a lot of fun opportunities to organize and to paint villains of the billionaires and corporate class and build community in the meantime. So I would just recommend folks to check that out. And we have a couple new major projects on the table. The Wet'suwet'en people have spent years and years trying to defeat the Coastal GasLink that is now operation. And also, of course, our host nations here that have been trying to fight the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And suddenly we have a bunch of new pipelines on the table and ready to go. So I would also just direct people to figure out what local issues are happening in your context and to follow the nations that are leading that. And I want to underline again my call to action to just learn whose territory you're on and check out some of the community events that might be happening.
Pulse of Change is hosted and produced by Lana Voracek. Audio production and music by David Acuna. Artwork by Alana Thorburn-Watt. If you enjoyed this episode, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. You can also find a transcript with citations for this episode in our show notes. This episode was recorded and produced in the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This podcast is funded by the Sustainability Projects Fund of the Alma Mater Society at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. If you'd like to connect with us on social media, you can follow our Instagram at Pulse of Change Podcast. Thanks for listening.